welcome to Mind Gourmet. My name is Nina Kaiser. I'm the co-founder of Mind Gourmet and, as always, your host today. My today's guest is teacher, mentor, and visionary thinker, Pepper Lewis. Hi, Pepper, welcome.
Hi, Nina, how are you?
I am so happy we are having this conversation today. And I feel like diving straight in, but before I do, I would like to introduce you a little bit to our audience. Beloved by many, Pepper Lewis is often called a wise woman of the earth. Pepper is widely recognized for her original contribution to the advancement and redefinition of contemporary spiritual life. A teacher and visionary thinker, her work has influenced scholars and practitioners worldwide in disciplines ranging from education and business to healthcare, the military, and more. Pepper is the author of 5 books, dozens of media programs, and a rich legacy of work in the field of personal development. Her teaching voice and writing skill are lyrical and evocative. Her wisdom is refreshing, accessible, and relevant. And I so resonate with your bio, what it says about your wisdom, because I experienced it, because I have attended your workshop in San Diego was it March? It was, I think, spring of 2018. And I so enjoyed it. It was so meaningful for me to hear you tell your story, to learn from you, and to experience your channeling, and to have the possibility to chat with you a little, and also to invite you to this conversation, which we're having right now, and I'm so happy about it. So would you share with us your journey to who you are today?
Wow, well, that's a long, a few cycles around the sun, as we would say.
Well, take your time.
My journey, in some ways, we could say, when do we begin our journey? Do we begin it when we're born, or do we begin it when we start to maybe ask questions about who we are and why things are the way they are? And in some ways, I think that's really the beginning of the journey, because it's time when we begin to set out to look for answers, or that the answers that we received are either no longer satisfying, no longer true for us. And so then we set out on this journey, both inner and outer, of discovery. And along that journey, my goodness, how many lifetimes do we live in each of these journeys, in each of these cycles around the sun? I think we become so many different people as we investigate some of these things. So for me, as a young child, maybe by 7 or so, as many of us are questioning, how did I get here? Who are these parents? They don't look like me. They don't feel like me. I must have been adopted. I must be from another planet. If I'm not from another planet, they must be from another planet. So, all these questions, because I thought none of this makes sense at all. And so I started at whatever age that could be, investigating. And for me, that was libraries. So I would sneak off to libraries to kind of study about other people, other civilizations, other everything, trying to find some kind of continuity in that. And I would also sneak off to different religious institutions. I would try out a variety of different churches and synagogues and mosques, whatever I could get to in a walking distance from home, because I was a child, really. So, and I was just looking for, where does any of this come from? And along those lines, I had some, I can call them events in my life that kind of tell you that this isn't ordinary. They weren't incredibly extraordinary yet, but they didn't seem like everyone else was walking around talking about having some of these events. And so you learn at a young age to kind of keep things like that to yourself. If you see something that may or may not have been visible to everybody in the room, and you're looking around and no one's saying anything, you think it's maybe a good idea not to say anything either. But at a younger age, it was even small things like knowing where lost objects were, or where the bad kids had hidden the things that the good kids wanted back, or something like that. Little children's things. But there was a recognition that there was something about me that was different. And of course, when you're a child, you don't think of yourself as special. You think, what's wrong with me? And when is this going to go away? And I hope nobody finds out before it's too late. And what if I'm stuck this way forever? And all those things. So I really did keep it to myself. And there were some other, physical things, some little tiny headaches and little tiny seizures and things that it would be easy to attribute them to as a child. But anyway, later in life, a little bit into more adulthood, some of these things converted into the continuation of at least having a recognition that there are things and beings around us all the time, not just some of the time, but really all of the time, that just because we can't see them with our physical eyes means that it's a limited understanding of our brain, and what we're taught is real and unreal. And I gained confidence in my ability to trust those things more than some of the physical realities around me. And I was fortunate enough to be able to pursue them in my life. So, we could say hearing and seeing and clairvoyance and clairaudience and some of the things that are really very ordinary and really not very special. I just want to keep saying that, except that we as a race of beings have not pursued this knowledge very much, and we've come to kind of hold it off a little bit, or try and find other reasons for it. Really just a matter of developing a little bit more right brain rather than left brain. And like I said, fortunately I did do that. So that's most of my quick version of the journey. What I think you found interesting when we were together, that I sometimes say, and we don't hear as much, is that these abilities, if we want to call them that we can't always depend on them, that just like anything else, they come and go. And that I did have a period in my life associated with, we could say the trauma of the passing of my parents and a few other things going on, in which they almost completely disappeared from my life. And for someone who's used to having them from a very young age, then all of a sudden I truly felt handicapped. I felt like I couldn't see, I couldn't think, I couldn't read people, I couldn't see their faces, their intentions. And it was an interesting time because I came across people who were really not well intentioned, and some pretty severe things happened to me for a few years there, while these things recalibrated, I can say now. But at the time, I really had no reason to believe that they would return. They were gone as gone can be. And so we don't often hear teachers talking about things like that, because we don't always want people to see us at our weakness. I don't think anyone really wants to see each other or be perceived that way. And myself included for a while. But after a while, when it really didn't seem like it was coming back, that became interesting in itself. Like someone who has to have therapy, how to live like a normal person. Like, oh my God, this is how normal people live. How do they do this? And so it was a learning process. And then around 2014 or so going back closer to 5 years now, they began to slowly come back. And I really didn't know at the time whether I was going to understand things in the same way again. So it's a process now, and I actually feel very blessed the way people do who have gone through tremendous sacrifices, and they'd say that they never want to do that again, but they're so glad that they had that opportunity to learn about things in a way that could not have happened any other way. I could say that there were times that I really, just didn't even think of some of these gifts, if we want to call them that, didn't really even give them credit for very much. And I was due. I was due to have a hard look at things that way. So I guess it would be right to say that as part of my journey as well.
And even though I don't have these experiences, I know what it feels when I am in a very contracted period of my life, where suddenly my inner senses, my empathy, everything seems to be gone. And it's almost like, how do I navigate this life? Because I rely so much on it, and then I feel almost like hibernating until I'm going back into balance. Now, for me, I know it has mainly to do how peaceful and balanced I am, but it might be a little bit of what you have experienced, and I imagine it hard to get used to.
Yeah, it's a little bit like not knowing exactly where your true voice comes from. You can speak, but you don't even know if you're really speaking from your true voice. It's a little bit like seeing, but at the same time feeling that you're kind of blind. And this kind of trust that we know who we are, or what we want, or what
Yes.
our even might look like. Those things are like just temporarily gone, or maybe not. It's kind of a feeling of being really lost. Yeah, lost, or kind of like stuck between two light places. It's a little bit of everything, and you really have to in some ways it's a struggle not to become depressed in these periods as well, regardless of who has them, because you really don't know exactly what's next. You really don't know you imagine it's not going to last forever, but at the same time you don't know what it's going to look like on the other side of that either. There's a kind of a knowing, like you might not be the same person when you come out of this event or period or something like that. So there is kind of a readjustment. In some ways that helped me to work with military personnel who come back from their experiences abroad or wherever they've been into completely different environments where different things are expected of them once again. And so there is a readjustment period as well. So from all these different walks of life, I can say that before this happened, when I said, oh, I know what you're talking about, or I understand, I think I did not understand it as well as I do now.
Yeah. And I remember when we talked last time, we quickly touched on how and what spirituality actually is today. And I remember, say, 15, 20 years ago in this, so to say, spiritual community, it was very, it's not the right word, but I would say fashionable to go see channel mediums and so on. And I like the idea that in our own evolvement, it's part of our journey to tune into what life means to us and everything that it has to offer in terms of energies and experiences. And I remember you saying there's actually a new way of tuning into all those energies today. So is that what you would call redefining contemporary spiritual life?
Yes, in some ways, because I think we are at a place now where it is easier to walk into a room, we'll say, and have it be all right whether you subscribe to a particular religion or not, or to a particular deity or not, or to easily say, I am Buddhist or Hindu, or I study Christian mysticism, or the Sufi tradition really interests me, or all of those. There's a comfort now where people would say, oh, that's so interesting. I also read this book. I didn't really get it, but I read this book. And so two people can begin a dialogue of something like that. And that is, I would say, is newer to spirituality. there are people who study only things that we could call evidence-based, which is not the same thing as to say only if science approves of it, but it's to say my experience has taught me this and has increased my spirituality, my ability to be in tune with my world and whatever may be beyond this world, whether it's something or nothing, is also spirituality. So spirituality today, I think in some ways is more than morality, more than ethics. It is a fine tuning of the finer senses in life that connect us to each other, connect us to nature, connect us to the earth, and connect us to the heavens. Because whoever we are all looking at the heavens. We're all, if we're studying them, we could be looking for the next meteor shower. If we're into astrology, we might be wondering about when the signs are going to shift from one to the other. We are, imagining stars and whether we can see the planets or not. So we look far and above and far and below into the oceans. And I don't think that there's ever a time that we haven't been more curious about what's out there, whether it's the deepest part of the oceans or because of earth changes, or the deepest parts of ourselves, because we are now investigating genes and DNA and all the different things that we can know about ourselves. And all of that, if we don't want to call it spirituality, it certainly dovetails with it because it causes us to ask deeper questions than we might have before.
Yeah. And one deep question that I guess almost everybody asks is, who do we come from? And is there something like a greater power that we could call God? And is the God we know today different from the God we used to know? Or what might spirituality look, say, in 100 years from now? And I would like to know what you think about it. My personal take is like, we change, and so necessarily our perception of things needs to change too. But what do you think about God or the greater whole, or whatever we might call it, being always the same or different and evolving?
Well, I think from the relative, my Buddhist practice would say that from the relative standpoint, it's always changing, because in the relative world that we live in, change is the only constant. And in the absolute world where everything is absolute, then permanence or not change could be the only constant. And so we could say that God is both changing and not changing depending on our relative or absolute perspective as well. But maybe what changes is not what we call God, but maybe the face of God. What does the face of God look like? Maybe according to how our own faces and ideas and beliefs and structures change, the face of God and how it manifests in our world, in our life, changes. And I think that is evolving now as well. It is a time when the age of Pisces is beginning to yield its power or strong beliefs in deity, in God, to the Aquarian age, which is more a sign of air and a sign that is more, let's say, spirit moving without the harder beliefs. And so that is changing as well. In 100 years from now, I will be careful how I say this, but I believe that we will have less interest in the Bible as we know it today, and that we will both discover and allow ourselves to begin to know other truths that we can know for ourselves. In other words, the historic aspects that are told to us now, we've come from this history. I believe that even history will remake itself when we allow it to, will become broader, will become deeper, and there will be more variety that we can see where and how we have journeyed. But we have to loosen the holds of those really tight holds of history and the really tight holds of the dogmatic truths that have existed in this in the last several centuries, really.
And do you mean by this also really tuning inside and feeling the truth inside? Maybe not instead of, but additionally to relating to what might be written here or what might be said here, or whom we learned in our childhood, for example, to know as our authority.
Yes, yes, and that's a very good way to put it. So, an authority or a knowledge, or what we have been told to take on word or to take on faith. So, faith, I believe, will depend a little bit more upon what truths we can know for ourselves, but not so much of an inner searching. I believe that there will be outer truths that confirm our inner feelings that are just not available to us yet. So in order to rewrite history, we have to find that history, and we have to have enough of the population sign on to it so that it becomes approved of in some way, allowed, approved, invited. And we're not quite there now. You know, when we could say that Christianity or any other religion spread around the world, it did so because there was enough advocates for it. There was enough people that so strongly believed, and it had touched their own life in such strong ways that they moved out into the world with these truths, and other people felt and sensed them at such a deep level that they also wanted to feel that and be included in that. And so that's how, you know, these things spread. And then, of course, at some point, if it stops being true, that doesn't necessarily stop it from spreading. And so that, I think, is what happens with some things. Then they become hardened, and then it's a matter of wanting people to adopt them, whether or not they have felt them firsthand or not. But they are told in some ways to adopt them based on, well, they must be true because we're telling you that they're true. That's where we are now, that people no longer want to take that on faith. It's not that they don't have faith, it's that they don't want to necessarily take truths that have been around for a very long time that are not so profound maybe today. And so that is turning some people away from the traditional religions, but not necessarily from spirit, which is really the in-breath and out-breath of life.
Yeah, and at least in my perception, it seems that what is more and more validated is our feeling for if something is really congruent and kind of vibrationally aligned, and learning from these people instead of certain sets of rules or certain traditional communities. And speaking of, well, what's happening in the world, I was wondering, I mean, there seems to be, I mean, it always depends on how we look, but there seems to be so much going on within the world that is not necessarily considered very beautiful, like earth changes, climate change, economic conditions, overconsumption. And do you think there needs to be a light shed on things before you can, like, order them, or before you can do something about them, so that they are so, I mean, sometimes we could get desperate about what we see.
Yes. I think that there are some things that we probably knew was not a good idea. And we humanity, you know, don't want to not pointing fingers in any direction here, but we could say that we, humanity, knew better. You know, we might be able to say that about tobacco use early on. We might be able to say that about different resources that have exploited people or countries, or that we knew in some way that were limited resources and that only a certain amount of people could become wealthy from. But I don't think that we could say that about everything. For instance, even though the overuse, overconsumption of plastic now is at such a critical level that it's affecting our oceans, that we are finding microplastics in our body scans and so much of that, I don't think that we could have seen that coming necessarily. I don't think that we could have seen that we would start to make everything out of plastic, or that everything would end up in the oceans, or that they would break down so slowly that we would not know what to do about it at a certain time. So some of these things, just the progression of events has to be our teacher. But now that we know, now that it's in the known universe, in our reality, now I would say that it does fall upon us to see, how do you want to clean that up? How can we change? How can we turn this around? So I think at times we don't see everything coming and we're kind of hit with it. And in that way, I could say that we're not completely at fault, but I would say that now that we know, we are responsible and we owe it to the world, to future generations, to the earth, to find solutions before things become worse. So I think it's a combination. I don't think we can blame ourselves for 100% of global warming or climate change or earth change, but we are now a generation and a people who are educated to these facts. And so now it is time to do something about it. And if we do suffer the effects of some of the worst things that can happen from some of these, we can't completely say, well, I never saw that coming, or it's not my fault, or it's them, not me, because we are participating to the degree that we are. And the world is kind of crazy right now. It's messy out there everywhere, no matter where you look. For every wonderful story I find about some solution to something, I find 3 other things that you say, you got to be kidding, this can't still be happening in this day and age. And you shake your head and you just think this just can't be happening, but it is. And we have a way of somehow saying, well, that's just human nature, in a way that we say, well, that's the worst of us and there's a best of us. But when we say it's just human nature, it's okay to say that. It's okay because we're just human. But it's really not okay. We're not just human. We are beings, we are human bodies. We are aware, intelligent beings. We're not just human.
Yeah, and we all have choices. And like, I can choose the tomatoes packed in plastic, or I can buy them loose. I can drink water from glass bottles instead of plastic, or, I mean, that's just on the consumer side, but I believe so deeply, even though what's happening often seems so daunting, that it's our power as individuals to make changes, and that if we as a collective make changes within ourselves and in our personal behaviors, this is a very powerful thing. But, oh, sorry.
It is, we are powerful, we do have choices, but it's also, it's very simple to say that. It's very simple to say, well, we can just choose something else, because I have come into different environments and met with people all around the world who we could say for certain that compared to us, they are powerless, they are choiceless. They do not have, their choices are so minute, so tiny little wiggle room, which barely counts. that it's not almost even fair to say that they have choices. That's something that we say in our socioeconomic class, in our Western world. It's a lot easier to say, well, we have choices, we can choose something to be or do different. And until you've been or lived with people who don't have a choice, it's important to note that as well. The interesting thing is that most of the people that I've met who I would say are powerless and choiceless had less of a problem or less issues with the world, either the way it is, or in some ways we're more hopeful that these things are temporary. So it's a very interesting thing as well to note that when some of the things in our life don't move, other things do. I may not be saying that very, very clearly, but I've met people that could say that they are powerless, at least now. I'm not saying that their whole life will be that way or that they are trapped, but compared to how we live, they would certainly say that and feel that way.
Yeah. Would you say, in some sense, this increases our responsibility to use our choices wisely?
Well, if we, yes, I would say yes, and yet, it's so hard to do that in some ways as well. But I think that we can employ the wisdom that we have to the degree that we have in the environments in which we operate, that there's always, a little bit more than we can do. There was one of those, I'll call it a focus week, one of those weeks, for instance, where your community says, eat locally. We're only going to eat locally, or only eat fresh foods, nothing packaged or processed, or I don't know, something like that. Even to try and do something like that for a week can sometimes, once the novelty of the first day or 2 days is over, the rest of the 5 days can be very difficult when you see how quickly you come up against processed things and that's just a simple example. So when it comes down to using our full wisdom to see how we can really have an impact in the world and change the world, it can become daunting. And so sometimes people throw up their hands, and even though we are not powerless, we might think that we are, because we think, for instance, that the giant corporations are so in charge of everything that we can't get away from them anyway, or the banking industries or the finance centers or whatever it is. And so we begin to think that we alone, who we are, we can't really do much or affect much change. But the idea is that from within, even our desire and intention for the world to look different than it does today, that's a lot. That's a lot, even to redirect a few of those thoughts that would normally be in your head going, na 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 na. And do the laundry, and oh yeah, I forgot to pay the bill, So even if we can just redirect ourselves a little bit during our day to having positive, intentional, creative thoughts and an outlook on a world that is quickly changing, improving, enhancing, all those things that we can think about, that makes a difference without having to subscribe to any other belief or program or author or diet or anything else.
Yeah, and speaking of change on a very individual and personal level, something that I experience so often in myself, but I hear also my friends speak about it when we chat, is that we so desire change, either because we want to move in a certain direction or because we want to move away from something. And as soon as we seriously embark on it, we hit our own greatest resistance, which sounds so counterintuitive because, we desire that change and then we basically come up against ourselves. And so what would you say? Why is that? And how can we embrace change that then we can also bring out into the world with more ease?
Well, I can't answer it well to the degree that I can answer that. And the reason I can answer that is because I'm just like you. Because that's the basic reason why I can answer that. So it's because I hit the same wall you do, because I hit that same resistance, because I hit the same fear. And the reason we hit it, and relatively soon and early in the process, is that the first thing we rely upon is our mind, our brain. We tell our brain, yes, I want to make this change. I want to go on this diet, a new regimen, a new eating program, a new exercise program, whatever example we want to use. And we hit that wall fairly on because our brain understands the past a great deal, and it understands the future by what we are telling it, and in some way by our ability to imagine a future. But the brain really does not understand the present moment. The brain really doesn't live in the present moment. We live in the present moment, and we are not our brain. Our brain is like a little mini computer that we use, and every once in a while we forget to update it or plug it in. I think, right? But the brain is trained to pull up all of our past experiences, and it says, oh, well, it might work, but remember you already tried this and this and that and the other, and those didn't work. So chances are this won't work either. So the brain's ability, or wanting to protect us as if we were, small, innocent children, is trying to protect us from hitting something else that we might say, oh, I couldn't do it, I failed. So we stop short of that. We start to hit that resistance, those walls, those warning signs, so that we will hit those before we fail. So we kind of pull back beyond that. And we have not developed our ability to imagine, to direct ourselves toward a real imagination, not a fantasy imagination, but the ability to create an image and to formulate a life and the life events, the steps that would lead towards that image coming about. We have not been trained in how to formulate imagery, vision. We have not been trained in visioning enough to see something all the way through. So we kind of get stuck in the middle. And as we know, we tend to more fall back on experience, and negative experiences are heavier. They're more dense than positive ones. And so there's the resistance. So what to do about it? There are exercises based on true intention, and kind of like a rewiring of polarity, where you take the mind and the brain, which is already connected to the heart, and there is a brain, or we could call it an operating system in the heart, that is much more aligned with positive outcome, with the formation of intentions. And if we can connect these two together, then we can find that present moment that can link more to the future than to the past. For some people, that might mean incremental growth or movement in a direction, and for some people it just might mean just finding that spot. So science confirms this. There is a nerve that's getting a whole lot of attention these days, called the vagus nerve.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It's getting a lot of attention because it carries serotonin and so many other things that we need. But it actually is a direct connection, just about direct, from the brain to the heart. And so there is a direct pathway from one to the other. And something that I read just a few days ago, as a matter of fact, said that, we always think of the brain sending out these neuron connections to the rest of the body and everything. Well, I read that the heart actually sends twice as many messages to the brain as the brain sends to the heart. And it uses this highway of this vagus nerve to do that. So this is in some ways what I mean by newer definition of spirituality as well. So this is evidence-based way to say between the brain and the heart, we can manifest in our life, we can bring about a different life or experience. And I would call that spirituality, and it does not necessarily, you don't have to say who or what you believe in order to activate that.
Right. And would you explain a little bit more what visioning is?
Yeah, that's become really popular now too. To use the word visionary is a popular what. Everything that makes sense for a little bit gets overused so quickly that after a while it doesn't make sense. So a visionary is someone who, or it could be a process as well, a visioning process or a visionary person. So it's not as simple as saying just someone who thinks outside the box, because that's sort of our first inclination would be to say that, well, it's someone who doesn't immediately take the known route from point A to point B. But a visionary is someone that in some ways can envision and potentially create a variety of different experiences or outcomes from the same premise or the same idea. So that's not the same thing as just a thought that's outside of the norm or out of the box. It might be a complete different way to get something. So, as a simple example that everyone can identify with, we could say that Steve Jobs from Apple Computer was a visionary. The computers that he created, the phone that he envisioned, our way of communicating that he envisioned was completely different than what we had known at the time. And all of the different things that it could do were also much more than just a telephone. So it's not that he just envisioned a different telephone, he envisioned a communication device that also became so many different things and still is. So that's a visionary product, or was at the time, from a visionary person. So a visionary is someone that potentially envisions not just a different way of doing things, but something that is entirely different, and something that is also timely, necessary, perhaps inventive, creative, brings about the betterment of people. We so think, and all of those things are visionary processes. So they would entail slightly different processing within the brain, different ways of sending those messages, and a different way of almost creating something different. So I would say, instead of sending something to the printer, a visionary would send something to an idea to the 3D printer. It would come out in 3D or 4D or in a different way. So those practices, products, and people I think of as visionary. Yeah.
So when we create our futures, like it's often said, we combine our intentions and charge them with our elevated emotions. Would you say that goes into the direction of visioning, like seeing something into reality in some sense?
I think it can. I think that definitely counts as visioning. So visioning is, it's a process, and in visioning we would engage more than just the brain. So we take the brain and the mind and the heart and potentially our dream state, and potentially a meditative or contemplative state. So we keep adding, we are adding all of this to the vision process. So it's not just a matter of thinking a thought and then thinking it again and thinking it through. It's not necessarily a logical or even reasonable proposal in the beginning, although the outcome may very well be. But it does not have to follow a very logical A, B, C, D, straight through route. It's its own process. And it would be great if we were taught these things, I think, in schools. I think it would be great. would be great. If we were taught that before we were even taught some of the other logic, reason kind of things, I think that the brain would probably balance out a little bit more than it is now. We so emphasize not just learning, but that test taking, regurgitating kind of learning, that in some ways it shuts down these other processes early on. And then once the brain is developed, then we have to go back and kind of reopen some of these channels, and we have to work a little harder to reopen them and make them okay again. Whereas if we did it the other way around, you know, the logic would kick in. We would recognize, okay, the stove is hot, don't touch it or you'll get burned, you know, a little. We would get that. We would not miss out on that lesson, I think.
Yeah, and I think we are so much taught to rely on our senses, our physical senses, and on that sense that is called common sense. But we all do have intuition, and we all have this inner guidance. And like you said before, only because we don't see the, for the eyes, invisible realm, it doesn't mean that it's not there. And especially having been an elementary teacher for so long, I can only say, yeah, there are so many things that I would like to see taught in schools, and I so agree with you. And it's just we would, maybe it would be wrong to say we would have an easier life, because with new abilities come new challenges, but we would surely have a different life.
Yes, we would. And you know, like I said earlier, when we too much emphasize common sense, human nature, things, we diminish ourselves. We diminish the possibility of rising. We leave it very much to a much smaller population or segment of humanity to rise up and beyond that. So we diminish all of us by saying that.
Yeah, and it's really not necessary, because I feel like there's grandness in everybody. And I've read this, I think it's a story or a metaphor, but it has really stuck with me. And I don't know if it's true, but the story says that if baby elephants are chained to a pole, for example, so that they stay in their territory, say, they don't learn that as adults they could so easily walk away because they are so strong. And I feel like if we were if we were taught, or maybe not untaught, to use our strengths, intuitions, our inner knowing, there would be so much more possible, because we would just know that we can.
Right. Yes. So, you know, you know, on Easter Island, they have those great statues that we all kind of recognize, the moai, and so for, you know, for hundreds of years we saw their head and studied them and wondered why they are, where they are, and why so many and why so large, and we just accepted it. But you know, some years ago, enough people began to think of what else they could be or what else they could mean, and they started digging them out and realizing that they had bodies, so that the earth had covered them up to the head. But as they started to dig through that, they realized that they're much larger statues, that they're actually full standing statues, and no one, a certain amount of people. So it's kind of like that 100th monkey kind of theory, until enough people start thinking that something could be different, or that we have this ability, we will go on thinking that we're buried up to here, and that we are only our heads, and you know, there may or may not be anything below there, but we're only, what we see here is the only part that's real, until it's not. But there has to be enough consensus of people to say, this is natural, this is necessary, this is important. And somewhat at this point, unless we think in terms of, someone, a huge gain from someone, or the survivability of something, we're not really seeing a lot of these changes. We are in the neurosciences. There's a lot of things happening in the neurosciences now. So science is really pushing a lot of boundaries right now. But while it does, it seems that spirituality is kind of holding back a little bit right now. It's kind of been dealt some blows. Traditional religions have been dealt some blows in some ways. Spirituality was dealt its blows by, we could say, some of the de-evolution of New Age thinking. In some ways that had its height and its crescendo and then came down. And so it got dealt a few blows in there as well. But science is very strongly pushing forward now. So if we could balance these two, they're not polarities, but we approach them as if they were. If we could balance these a little bit, I think everyone could gain. And it's happening, not as quickly as I would like or as you may like, but it's happening. I'll say I'm forward thinkingly positive in that regard.
Me too. Oh, this is so interesting and inspiring. So for everybody who would like to know more about you or maybe work with you, where can they go and what options do they have?
Well, the best way to reach me and find out about me right now is through, it's a new website, so it's not completely developed yet, but the website is Pepper Keen Lewis. So just the way it sounds, my first name, Pepper, like salt and pepper, Keen, Keen, which I use now as a middle name in deference to my parents who passed, and the last name Lewis. So if you put that, you'll find my website, and you'll find out a little bit more about what I'm doing. There will be some things added there very shortly. There are some classes coming up on gaining more wisdom or using the wisdom we have, or concentrating in our heart and mind in this way that I talked about a little bit earlier, so that much more of our wisdom is available to us on a daily basis. So that Wisdom Rising class will be coming up shortly. Another class that I call the Language of the Birds is also coming up. These will be online classes, luckily, so allow me to be home a little bit more often. And the Language of the Birds it's the language of, we'll say, the higher forces of nature, and how we are that and have the ability to use that and communicate with that truly as its own form of language, as its own wisdom that has existed and maybe fallen into disuse for many years. And it's time to call all of these resources back into the forefront again. It's time to call the aliveness of the earth and its kingdoms and nature, which is what we are. So really this is about relinking or bringing ourselves back online as the true nature beings that we are as well. So that's coming up. And some travel that I will be doing, not till later in the year, but I will go to Moscow later this year, probably at the end of October, November. So we just kind of confirmed that actually earlier this morning, so that I knew that I could say it today. And it's really one of my favorite places to go in the world. I can't say exactly why, but I could say that I've been there several times. It's been now a number of years, but the people that I have met there are open, hungry, intuitive, welcoming, so many different things. So it'll be really nice to be back there again. And then you can find me on Facebook too. I do live chats every 3-4 weeks. I do live chats on different topics, and I'll be doing them on Zoom coming up as well. We'll switch them around a little bit, and I do private sessions when it matters, when it's important, when it seems right. And so you can find all those things about me online. You can drop me a line, you can get in touch with me, and see what else is going on.
Yeah, and we will link to all important places right below this interview, so everybody can find you. So before I close this wonderful conversation, is there anything you think we have left out that needs to be mentioned right here and right now?
I think the only thing I would add, and we didn't so much leave so much time to go into it today, but there is one other event that I do that's kind of helpful, and I tend to call it Eyes Wide Open, just because it helps to really see where we're going. And I do these once a year, so that's coming up probably sooner than any of these other things that I mentioned. It will probably be an online event on March 8th and
Hmm.
9th. I think I looked at that. And last year's version is available under free audio on my website. So there's a whole hours, probably 5 hours worth of listening just there alone. But Eyes Wide Open will be more about really what's happening this year and into our near future. I do use that visioning process to look and see and offer some cautions and offer a few bright spots and offer really what directions we're looking at, something that give us some guideposts. So I'll be talking more about that and doing more chats about that as well. And I'm sure we'll find another time to talk about that soon too.
Of course. So thank you from my heart for sharing this time and space with me. I have been so looking forward to it, and I've been so enjoying our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very nice, very nice. And to everyone who's watching or listening or participating in some way, really, we share this journey together. We are not as separate from each other as we think we are. We are so connected in so many different ways that we are just bumping up against each other's hearts, I think, all the time. So thank you to everyone who participated as well.
So goodbye, everybody, and always remember to take the driver's seat of the car called your life and create this lifetime to your taste. It's our pleasure here at Mind Gourmet to support you with our food for thought. Bye, Pepper. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.